back. We're going to have our concluding conversation now. And with Professor Pat Parker and Professor Claude Clegg. And I am going to launch this conversation. I want to invite people to continue to send in questions by the Q&A function. But I am going to ask a preliminary question to each panelist. So I want to ask each of you this question. What is the most important achievement and legacy of Ella Baker? This is for Pat. And how does it compare with Barack Obama's approach? And then for Claude, the question is, what is the most important achievement and legacy of Barack Obama, and how does it compare with Ella Baker? So I'll start with you, Pat. What do you see as her most important legacy and achievement, and how does it differ from what Barack Obama did?
Fascinating question, Lloyd. Thank you for that. I think that for Ella Baker, this is my opinion, of course, others may have different readings, but I think that if there is a singular achievement, it is her legacy of community power. Sort of the promise of democracy that lives in the capacity for people to define their own problems and to be able to see structures that are beyond, sort of individual interest, and to start to think about in that collective way. In my book, I talk about creating spaces for people to see personal roots toward collective consciousness. So lots of people can have personal roots toward confidence in themselves and their own ability to do something, but to be able to see the connection to the collective and see the power of community. I think that is her singular achievement of leaving us with those kind of tools. And that it's interesting to think about how that differs from Barack Obama, but I think President Obama, I think I sort of answered the question in that, because just listening to Claude's analysis, he seemed to have bet his presidency on that ability to kind of to be calculated in a way to make sort of broad decisions that will impact the collective good, but sometimes you have to go around the collective good to do that. So it's almost like at the other end of that spectrum. Somehow your question is a good one, because I think there is something to be learned in a tension between both of those. And so that's how I would answer.
Just quick follow-up. Was she personally ambitious like Barack Obama?
Well, I mean, yes, to a certain extent. I mean, she had to have been right to be able to have the accomplishments that she had and to face the challenges that she did. So to me, I think that there's a difference between a personal ambition that, I guess both of them were working for the collective good, but just coming at it, she just had a different philosophy in terms of, sort of I guess the tools that you would use sort of to coalesce that collection, to bring everybody along as you did that, even as you have to have a certain amount of self-preservation, I think. Yeah.
Okay, well then I want to ask you, Claude, what do you think is the most important achievement and legacy of Barack Obama, and how does it compare with what Ella Baker did?
I think that there are a number of achievements or takeaways from the Obama presidency. And I think, as Pat is saying, that it's best to look at this as sort of a continuum, and to place Obama within a lineage of black leadership in which Ella Baker is part of that lineage. I think that Obama bets on young people in an explicit sort of way. His appeal is directed towards sort of a post-baby boomer, millennial, young people. If you look at the people who worked on his campaigns, even his administration, in the same way that Ella Baker bets on young people, the SNCC folks. I think the idea being that, one, Obama, I think when he becomes sort of nationally known, he's probably a bit younger than Ella Baker is, and who I think is probably in her late 50s by the time SNCC is formed. But I think Obama is sort of parlaying or leveraging his own youth to appeal to a sort of post-baby boomer, younger demographic of people, 21st century sensibilities, internet, digital age folks who come out in droves to put him in the White House. I think it was a good bet for him to make. He also comes out of this sort of community-based leadership model and organizational model, not unlike what we see happening in the 1960s with SNCC and SCLC and so forth. And he purposefully puts himself into that mold when he goes into community organizing in Chicago. And I don't think it's a cynical way of just saying, okay, I have this on my resume, and and I'm going to Harvard and so forth. I think he's actually affected by his time in Chicago, working on the South Side and so forth, meeting Michelle Robinson, who's from that community and shares a life with him. That's part of who he is as well. I do think there is a tension, and there's a lot of tensions here. One is Obama is a sort of encapsulation of a lot of different things going on. So he has a somewhat migration story to tell through his father and his mother in the Pacific world that some black leaders have to tell, but it's not a sort of international, world-spanning migration. He also has this tension in regard to the fact that he has a tale that links him to the people. He's raised, part of his life is a single mother. His father leaves. He sort of comes to the United States, or comes from Hawaii, which is a state, to the mainland, and struggles. Goes through this time period in the 80s where he's in Southside Chicago, but at the same time he's very atypical insofar as one of the big takeaways, important takeaways, is that, as I said during the talk, seeing this black first family in the White House, this highly accomplished woman and man, both Harvard graduates, raising children, and that in and of itself has a certain sort of payoff symbolically. But at the same time, it doesn't fix everything. That is, it's not the case that any black person can become president of the United States, even though we've had a black president. He has a certain sort of pedigree. He has an undergraduate degree from Columbia. He has a Harvard JD degree. He was a state senator. He was a U.S. senator. That's a certain sort of elite person. Yeah. So, so symbolically important to have had a serious, well-educated, thoughtful man and first family in the White House. But again, if anything, it sort of reifies, it sort of further embeds a sort of elitism in who has access to a certain sort of power. Again, he's not just anybody off the street named Barack Obama. He has to pass through Ivy League schools and the U.S. Senate and so forth, so he has a certain sort of pedigree. So there's, I like the way my colleague said, there's a tension between the sort of man of the people trying to embed himself in the people in Southside Chicago and so forth, which I think makes him very empathetic and gives him a worldview that is beneficial to social justice struggles and making him want to make government work for people. But again, there's an elite strata through especially the pedigree and educational pedigree and so forth that I think shows that the rarefied strata of American politics in which he operates is just that, a rarefied strata of American politics. He just happens to be a black guy who navigates this, but for the most part, that rarefied strata of politics is off limits to the average person.
Okay, well, thank you. I wanted to come back to to an issue also, and it came up in the chat at one point about an issue you raised, Pat, of embracing the humanity of people with whom you disagree. You said Ella Baker was able to do this, and it was one of her great achievements that kept her going. And you said also, Claude, that Barack Obama could deal with people who were very different from him in all ways. So could you each reflect a little on what Ella Baker and Barack Obama were able to achieve through this process of engaging, or radical listening even, with people who were so different? And this, we live in this incredibly polarized age where the other is just shut out. How did they do that?
Well, I think this is sort of the underlying theme of the work I'm doing right now is to think very seriously about those tools that, like radical listening. What is required to enter into a space where, first of all, for Ella Baker, I just want to kind of bring this time of her being, for example, in the Jim Crow South, where there is violence, where there is, the real danger of losing your livelihood if you were to enter into this active struggle against, oppression. So on the one level, she's entering into a space, and there's sort of this promise of humanity as we do this struggle, but then you lose your life. So to me, that's the thing that fascinates me, just in terms of working with people on the same issue. And so now imagine, broadening that to engage, to work across these lines of difference, for example, of where we are now, in terms of the backlash of in terms of that you spoke about, in terms of politics. So, I think that what Ella Baker, I think the test for me of how I'm thinking about radical listening and creating these participative spaces is to enter into these spaces, and for people that where there is even an ideological divide. So when she was in those male patriarchal spaces, there were people that she disagreed with, but she understood the larger, there was a larger collective goal that you were working on in terms of. But in this particular era, I think I may be answering more of the question. I'm not sure if this is precisely what you were asking, but this is the thing that excites me right now, is this promise of, for example, what we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, of people, the broad spectrum of people, whites, Asians, indigenous people and black people, all coming together to think about this question of social justice. I think that's an incredible opportunity, and it's about listening, being able to shift our understanding of how power is operating in a given moment, sort of coalitions that support indigenous aspirations, all BIPOC aspirations, having that capacity to be able to engage in all at all those intersections. That's to me is something that's very hopeful.
Understanding where others are coming from is a really challenging task for all of us. So I pose the same question to you. I know Obama was known. He was actually saying, I'm going to work across the aisle. I'm going to work with these white people, with these black people, with everybody. I'm going to bring them in. How did he do that? Is it possible?
He thought it was. He still thinks it is, I think. Part of that's who he is, at least the sort of public persona that he's crafted for himself. Centrist, left of center, politician, Democrat that can work across the aisle. He was not naive enough to think that becoming president of the United States would bring in this post-racial nirvana, but I think he was, and some people would say it was naive enough to believe that it might be possible to have a post-partisan period in which, in the midst of an economic catastrophe, 2 wars going on. You might have both the parties sit down, even with the Democratic president, and say, okay, let's put aside our labels as Democrats and Republicans, and let's get out of this economic crisis together. Let's get out of this war in Afghanistan and Iraq together. Let's talk about how we're going to deal with global warming and climate change together. So I did think that he believed there was an opening for that sort of coming together of people from different parts of the spectrum, the partisan spectrum. I again think it's part of his DNA, the way he was raised, again, in a mixed race household, at least at the very beginning. You know, he lived in Indonesia. Hawaii is our most diverse state. So that's part of what he saw coming up. And, you know, he lived with his white grandparents. And then he comes to the States and he immerses himself into the South Side and you know, has I think a very impactful experience with African Americans there. And then, you know, to the East Coast with elite Ivy League schools, and that's another sort of pool of experience that he has. He marries an African American woman who's from the South Side. So it's a really interesting, eclectic identity that he experiences and creates and self-fashions for himself. I think it serves him well mostly. It's where his optimism comes into play. I think that in the long, we don't know what the long view is going to be. We don't know what's going to happen in the next year or next 10 years or next 20 years, and whether he's right about this possibility of the country coming together. But the whole promise of Barack Obama is that he'd make us think more positively about race. Or even better than that, we wouldn't have to think about it at all. Maybe that's the promise. And I think for a lot of folks across the spectrum, blacks, whites, people of Hispanic origin, people of Asian descent, and so forth, that's what they projected on this guy. You know, this and his story, you know, he's raised by a white mother. His father's from Kenya. He's raised in the most diverse state in the country, Hawaii. He lives in Indonesia. He's the South Side of Chicago. Now he's at Harvard. A piece of him could resonate with everyone, and he really packages himself in the campaigns to do that. I think many of us underestimated the nature of the opposition to him, the sort of unrelenting nature of the Republican Party and conservatives to the idea of Obama, not just his philosophy and his policy prescriptions, but just the idea of that person being in the White House was offensive to them. And I think the Tea Party movement that emerges during the early part of his presidency, it's not all about that, but I think a large part of that resistance is the idea of this guy. With the funny name and this sort of suspect Muslim maybe origins, and you know, this black first family in this particular space. So and then that sort of getting articulated through resistance to everything he tried to accomplish in regard to legislation, and then to give rise to a person that, in my estimate, and I think in the estimate of a lot of other folks, was utterly unqualified for any position of trust, Donald Trump, in anybody's government, which I think is, you know, becoming clearer to us every day in regard to how low the bar was set, or has been pushed down by his presidency. So I think that even, again, as I was saying in the talk, even after having witnessed the last 4 years and the insurrection and all the things that we have gone through, Obama's still optimistic. He's optimistic about the idea of America, an America that will allow a guy like him, as he would say, with a funny name from the middle of the Pacific Ocean, from a broken family, to rise so high. So he has a compelling story to tell, and I think that compelling story makes him hopeful about the country and hopeful about the possibilities of the country. It makes a lot of people hopeful about the possibilities.
So this kind of leads to a final point I wanted to make. You both talked about how they They had very pragmatic plans. They tried to do specific things. You even called, I think, Obama kind of a technocrat, which is not an inspiring idea, or at least at the very most a pragmatic realist. And yet, both of them were inspiring people. This is what fascinates me. They had their eye on very specific problems, specific goals, but they inspired other people. So this is my question. What makes a leader like Ella Baker or Barack Obama ultimately someone who inspires others? We'll start with Ella Baker.
Ella Baker, yes. Well, I suspect that the answer may be the same for both of us. I think that inspiring leaders are those leaders in which people can see themselves in that leader. And I think for Ella Baker, she had that way of, again, thinking about entering into communities where people could just see the possibilities in the way she talked, in the way that she created a space for them to tell their stories, you know, to creating sort of a framework in which their stories of their everyday resistance was a part of a larger movement. She just had that way. And I think for those young SNCC activists, this was something that they experienced. There's often they talk about the fact that when she would hold that space, you know, they'd go off with some, and these are their words, I think, paraphrasing, some crazy ideas, and she would just say, well, now how would that play out? Like, she would always just, interested in how they were thinking. So I think inspiring leaders are those in which people see themselves and can see the possibilities going forward based on how that leader's framing.
That makes sense. So they're not totally distant, but they're somewhere that relates to you at some level. What do you think? Do you agree with? Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely agree with what Pat is just saying, and just to compliment really what she's just saying. I think that in both cases, Ella Baker and Barack Obama, it's an ability to understand the moment, and also to have a historical sense of how a people or situation has gotten to that moment, and to be able to articulate to people what the moment means and what's required. I think that the very definition of leader is the ability to inspire people to act. So I think those two things together, understanding the moment and one's place in the moment, and the place of others in the moment, and inspiring and talking about, being able to talk about how people are invested in that, and for that, those people to perhaps be able to see themselves in that leader's understanding of the moment. The best leaders are the best storytellers. The people who rule the world are the people who tell the best stories, period. Even if it's an awful story, if people believe the story, I think they think it's a good story, those are the people, whether it's fascists, whether it's communists, whether it's nationalists, whether it's Democrats, small d, tell a great story, people will follow. So being able to understand the moment, package it as a story, whether it's about your own origins or whether it's about your own struggle, whether it's about what you think the solution is, package yourself into that story and inspire people to act. I think that's the essence of leadership.
Well, we're going to have to come to the end here, but you have just, the two of you, summarized why you are the great interpreters of this situation, because we need to communicate and tell stories, and we need to place ourselves in a historical context and understand history. So if we don't understand history and we don't know how to communicate, we'll never take a step forward. But if we understand those two things, these leaders show us you can't just alter the structures, but there is a way to engage with them and gradually transform them. Is that a fair sum? I'm trying to bring it all together here, ladies and gentlemen.
Great.
I think it is.
Yes.
So I think we're coming to the end of our time. Do you have anything you'd like to say to the other as we wrap this up?
I'd like to say how much of a honor and a privilege it is to be with my colleague, Pat Parker. We work at the same university, and I see her on occasion, and I like watching her work, but this has just been an honor and a privilege. Unfortunately, although we work at the same university, I wish we had more forums for this sort of thing. So I appreciate Carolina Public Humanities and the Flawley folks for bringing us together. I'm a historian. I tend to talk to probably more historians than I should be talking to, as opposed to people from communication and other fields. So this has just been an honor and a pleasure, and just to learn from her,
Yes.
and to learn from my fellow historian who always asks smart questions.
Yes, for
So
sure.
I appreciate that.
Well, I would second that, and it's been a pleasure to be on this panel with you. And I should say that we'll have plenty more opportunities, I think, as hopefully the world starts to open up and we get more. And in my new position, you can count on there'll be another dialogue, and Claude Clegg will be a part of that at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. So I've said that publicly, and so
well,
you can count on that.
we're very
So,
excited
thank
about
you.
the future of the Institute for the
Yes.
Arts and Humanities, and Carolina Public Humanities is going to be part of all those conversations.
Absolutely.
And I want to thank all of you who have joined us and been part of this audience. We've also recorded this so that others can come back to this program as well. And we especially, again, thank all of you teachers who joined us, because you're doing essential work throughout our state of North Carolina. And thanks finally again to Paul Bonici for keeping us going in the techno world and keeping us informed with other resources in the chat. Have a great day, everyone, and celebrate Juneteenth as a celebration of progress, if not a final destination.